Hello, everybody. We're right on cue. This is SIBN, the Spanish-Irish Business Network. Welcome you all today. We're going to start and kick off in a couple of minutes, okay? We've already got quite a lot of attendees. What do you think, guys? Will we just kick off? I think it would be a good idea. So Mary Murphy here on behalf of the Spanish-Irish Business Network, and we're giving a warm welcome today to Liam Herrick. Liam is the Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, the ICCL. It's great to have you here with us today, Liam. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mary.
Ireland has been at the forefront and has in the forefront with their foreign policies, human rights, civil rights, and it's great for SIBN to be able to have this relationship with ICCL, and that's greatly due to as well Mal, who's with us today as well. Mal, he is a SIBN member and he used to be on the board of ICCL as well. So thanks for orchestrating all of this today, Mal, and for leading the way. Okay, listen, I'm just going to tell everybody that's joining us here today, you have Q&A down below. You can raise a hand. It's lovely if we can have a bit of interaction. There's also a chat box, so feel free to pop a question in as Liam and Mal chat. And if you want to just raise your hand, you can take the mic. And if you want to chat to me, then I'll put your questions forward. Okay, so over to you, Mal. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Yes, thanks, Mary. I don't know if we want to explain about the ambassador, or was he on the summary?
Well, the ambassador was very apologetic, but had minor surgery today, so unfortunately he can't talk much and had to bow out at the last minute. So we'll have to have a chat only with Liam. So we're very grateful for the flexibility today, and Mr. Smith will get back to us shortly on feedback from this session, I'm sure. It's also being recorded and we can chat about it another date via our newsletters.
Yes, I'm sure we'll be seeing him again. He's a good friend of the Spanish-Irish Business Network. But anyway, Liam, you're in Dublin. I can see in the ICCL's offices. I don't know if you want to just, not without going into an awful lot of detail, just a little bit of the historical background of Ireland and human rights before we get up to the present day.
Great, thanks very much, Mal, and great to be here with you all this evening. I might just say a little bit, first of all, about maybe the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. So we're a non-governmental organisation. We're completely independent of the Irish government, and we were set up in 1976 by former President Mary Robinson, Kader Asmal, who was a South African activist, leader of the Irish anti-apartheid movement, and a number of other lawyers and academics who were concerned with the human rights situation in Ireland primarily. And we campaign across a wide range of human rights issues, justice, equality, privacy, free speech, and so on, based in Ireland for nearly 50 years now. My own background is I've been in this role for 6 years, and for the last 25 years, I've been working in a range of human rights and law reform roles, mainly in Ireland and some international roles as well. And I suppose the idea really that we came to for this theme this evening was that originally myself and Ambassador Smith would talk about how important human rights are in terms of Ireland foreign policy, and then I would talk maybe about how human rights look from the ground up in Ireland in terms of what we see as some of the challenges and opportunities. But I think what's certainly a common thread throughout the history of Ireland as an independent country is that human rights have been a very important theme. And in the Department of Foreign Affairs foreign policy strategy, they talk about Ireland being committed to having human rights at the heart of both our foreign policy and our national policy. So I suppose we can maybe explore that then, just how that has played out for both the government, but then also for those of us working on the ground of human rights in Ireland as well.
Okay, so I suppose in terms of global challenges and things that obviously I know ICCL is very focused on Ireland itself, but it feeds into international organisations and supports international treaties, which Ireland has signed up to and is enforcing or encouraging the ratification of those treaties. Is there something you'd like to comment on at that level?
Yeah, certainly. I suppose we have a very particular history in Ireland, which informs our position with regard to human rights. Part of that is from our colonial history, and that can go all the way back, I think, even before the establishment of the state, that Ireland was seen very much as the champion of freedom, liberty, and the rights of small nations. And from the very beginning of the independence movement, there was a really strong drive in Ireland to build strong relationships with bodies like the League of Nations after the First World War, where Ireland played a very prominent role, and then going on to a very prominent role in the founding of the UN, the Council of Europe, and the European Convention on Human Rights. And in our diplomacy, Ireland was a key force in the growth of what was called the non-aligned movement, those countries which did not want to align themselves with either the Western powers or the Soviet powers during the Cold War period, but we're really talking about having independent foreign policy, the rights of small nations. And I think that really is an important starting point, really, about how all Irish governments have really placed a very strong emphasis on the rules-based multilateral system, and in particular, the protection of human rights. So, it is fair to say that the Irish government should take some credit in its consistent support for the importance of human rights. And I think that we have a very high status within both the UN and the Council of Europe systems, because we have seen to play a leading role in the development of, as you say, Mal, international human rights treaties and the growth of the international human rights mechanisms, which are so important at the global stage today.
And so following on from that, then to come back locally to Ireland, I mean, you've mentioned people like Mary Robinson and Cara Asman who are involved with ICCL, but there's been a lot of change in Ireland in the nearly 50 years since the organisation was founded. I don't know if you, because I'm conscious most people here have some link with Ireland, but we do hear, particularly being out of Ireland for the last 15 to 20 years, you hear a lot about referendums and new laws and things that have happened. I don't know, and we probably know, we've heard about them, but I think it's generally acknowledged ICCL has had a role in all of that. Would you like to comment on that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is one of the great tensions for every country, really, when it comes to human rights. I wouldn't want to be flippant and say it's easy to talk about human rights in the foreign policy space, and it's much more difficult to talk about it at the domestic level. But there's a huge amount of truth in that, So, I mean, I wouldn't at all underestimate the importance of the role that Ireland plays at the UN level in championing issues through our role, for example, on the UN Security Council, about climate change, migration, peace and security, disarmament, those big issues where Ireland does an incredible diplomatic job. But the other side of the coin, I suppose, is how do we live up to human rights at home and what we do domestically? And I suppose that's why you need to go back and understand what human rights standards are all about. Human rights standards were developed by the international community after the Second World War because of a philosophical belief that it's not good enough anymore to ask governments to comply with the law, because the Nazis and the other Axis powers in World War II had very often been acting within the law of their own states. It's that those laws themselves were inhumane. And the idea was that governments must be held to a higher authority or a higher standard. And that's what human rights is really all about. It's about holding national governments to a higher standard. And that then for a country like Ireland means that we ourselves must be held to that higher standard too. And I think one of the big challenges and the truths that's hard maybe to fully grasp when it comes to looking at human rights at the global stage is that we can no longer plausibly suggest that there's one group of countries that are for human rights and there's another group of countries that are against human rights, that there's this simple separation between the progressive and liberal countries and the authoritarian and despotic countries. Actually, what human rights will say is that every country has obligations. Every country has human rights duties to its own citizens and to others that it must respect. So when it comes to Ireland, we promote human rights internationally, but then we face some challenges at home. And I think when we look at our record in human rights, we see progress and we see some areas where we still have a bit to go. But one thing I think that is interesting about Ireland is that whereas our diplomats and governments were doing a lot of stuff at the international level, there was a whole other world of activity of Irish people, individuals, who were not acting on behalf of the state or the government, were very often acting outside it or even against it, that probably achieved even more for the advancement of human rights in the international level. So we've got this body of governmental work, institutional work, but we've also got a body of activists. And I think that that's something that we uniquely perhaps could celebrate. Maybe I might just mention some of them. Yeah. To go back even before we became an independent state, Daniel O'Connell, known in Irish history, particularly for the role he played in equality for Catholics and the emancipation of Catholics, was also a key global figure in the fight against slavery and had a very strong personal friendship and relationship with Frederick Douglass, the great anti-abolitionist. O'Connell was a key influence on Douglass, and Douglass similarly was a great influence on O'Connell. And Douglass spent a number of years touring Ireland in the 1840s. Moving forward to the period of independence, there were very strong links between the Irish independence movement and the independence movements in India, in South Africa, and later in other former British colonies. And if you look during the 1916 celebrations recently, the centenary celebrations in 2016, University College Dublin hosted an event with Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa, former president of Tanzania, Mugabe, and a former Indian Minister for Foreign Affairs to talk about how Irish revolutionaries and activists had influenced the liberation movements in all of those countries. There was a very strong link between the Irish civil rights movement, people like John Hume, and the civil rights movement in the United States. And then you had people like Sean McBride, who was former Irish revolutionary and Irish politician, who was a key figure in the development of the European Convention on Human Rights and was a chairperson of Amnesty International. People like Kader Asmal, who was the founder of ICCL, who founded the anti-apartheid movement in Ireland, became a minister in the first Mandela government, and so on, up until people like Mary Robinson, who was to become the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and right to the present moment, where there are key figures in the global human rights movement who are Irish men and women, and Irish organizations like Trócaire, Concern, Goal, Frontline Defenders are at the very forefront of the global struggle for social justice. So we have, I would say, a two-pronged kind of history of human rights in Ireland. We have a good government record at the diplomatic level, and then we have this particular Irish embodiment and personification within the global human rights movement. And I suppose that is something that maybe sets us apart from many other countries.
Yes, thanks, Liam. And actually, a question has just come in, and I think this is because human rights are continually evolving. And And, you know, I know, for example, the first international treaty on human rights was one thing, and then civil and political rights came in. And you get the concept of maybe there's a right to the internet or a right to a home. I mean, how do you see it evolving, and where do you think Ireland is on that spectrum, or if that's something you comment on, or what are you seeing in an Irish context that shows how this concept of rights is broadening?
Well, I think to start with the positive, you know, that what we've seen in the last 20 years in particular in Ireland is huge progress in respect for human rights at the domestic level, which I think has really elevated our image, our profile and our standing in the international human rights community. The peace process and the way in which the peace process put human rights front and center in terms of equal esteem between the different communities in the north and human rights institutions and so on, you know, was seen as a model for reconciliation and peace processes in many parts of the world. That certainly was a huge step forward, as well as, of course, of an end to the terrible human rights violations that had happened in the north. The second change, I think, is that Irish governments introduced a lot of laws which strengthened the protection of human rights for people living in Ireland, set up human rights bodies, such as the Human Rights Commission, incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into Irish law. The third area is in relation to equality. And it's difficult to overstate the significance of changes in Ireland, such as marriage equality in particular, the advancement of children's rights, the advancement of women's rights, in access to contraception, divorce, and abortion. So all of those areas, I think, show a rapid change in Ireland, where you don't measure human rights on a kind of a scorecard, but there's no doubt that those changes have placed us at the very top tier of countries that are recognized as having a very positive profile with regard to human rights. So I think that in that respect, we are seen to be in a very positive position now in terms of what happens domestically in Ireland in this area.
And then just to go into, I mean, I'm not sure how much you want to talk about certain topics, but I mean, there's two things that ICCL got very involved in recently. One was digital rights, which was something that was coming down the tracks and is something that, you know, you could see it happening with Ireland, but ICCL has become a leader in it. But there was also, quite interestingly, the issue of rights during the pandemic and the COVID restrictions. I don't know how much you'd like to comment on either of those or both of those, or.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that given those really important positive changes that have happened through peace and equality and liberalization in Ireland, you might be forgiven for thinking that we don't have any human rights challenges or problems here anymore. And not only might you be forgiven for thinking that, it might also be the case that Irish governments might actually put forward that view or that image from time to time. But going back to something I said earlier, is there's no country that has a perfect human rights record. And actually, I think what we're now seeing is that some of the problems and challenges that Ireland has in human rights are common to Spain and other countries as well. And some are particularly difficult for us because of our economic policy and our economic structures. So if we look first at those issues that are probably common to many countries, no democracy is perfect, no judicial or legal system is perfect. There's always tensions between powerful interests, state security on one hand, and the rights and civil liberties of the individual on the other. And we saw this very acutely during COVID, when states, the vast majority of states, and particularly countries like Ireland and Spain, were clearly trying to achieve the protection of public health. They weren't acting in a malicious or malign or authoritarian purpose. But in doing so, they had to balance the power of the state versus the rights of the individual. And in both countries, I think there were clear tensions. And I think on a mature reflection, I think it's possible that both states would maybe feel that they might have struck the balance a little bit differently from time to time. Certainly in an Irish context, that balance between state power and individual freedom still has some of the resonances from the period of the Troubles and the conflict. And I think Spain, similarly, and I certainly won't profess to be an expert on Spanish human rights or civil liberties today, but I know from our work with colleagues in Spain, the legacy of periods of conflict in terms of very strong police powers, very strong prosecution and state security measures, counterterrorism laws, counterterrorism resources. They're still a challenge for us today in Ireland. So we have special courts to deal with subversive and terrorist-related crime. We have very broad police surveillance powers in Ireland. And whereas many of those were relaxed after the peace process in Ireland in the 1990s, not all have been. So I think that that's one area of, I would say, continuing tension. Another emerging issue for us, which I think is a particular challenge to Ireland's business and Ireland's trade profile, is some of the areas in which we've chosen to really strategically invest from an economic development perspective are now coming into tension with some human rights concerns in ways that weren't maybe fully appreciated in advance. So I'll name three where I see a particular challenge. One is in terms of pharmaceuticals, which is a very important industry in Ireland, and the question of access to medicine, equal access to medicine as a human rights issue and the right to health. So because so many important pharmaceutical companies are based on and operate in Ireland, this is a particular challenge for the Irish government, because the People's Vaccine Campaign, a global campaign, human rights and development movement, is making the case that the pharmaceutical industry should relax intellectual property law and widen the access, particularly of developing countries, to vaccines and other relevant medicines. This is a challenge for Ireland because of the very strong power and influence that the pharmaceutical sector has here. A second is in relation to digital rights, where again, Ireland has strategically invested very significantly in the digital sector. And we know that the location of large companies in Ireland is of huge economic significance for us. That wasn't seen as being a human rights challenge until quite recently. But I think what we have learned about how some large technology companies operate, for example, in particular, Facebook, and the impact of Facebook's business model on democracy in certain parts of the world, on ethnic and racial violence in countries like Myanmar, for example, and what we've learned about Cambridge Analytica scandal and so on, that is posing some awkward, difficult questions for Ireland's relationship with these companies as well, and the extent to which we effectively regulate their operations here. And the third area is in relation to tax policy. Again, Ireland has a particularly aggressive tax policy towards inward investment. This again was not understood or seen as a human rights issue, I think, until quite recently. But organizations such as Oxfam, Christian Aid, and Trócaire, the large development organizations, are increasingly talking about tax justice as a global social justice and human rights issue. And particularly issues like tax loopholes, tax transparency, as being a human rights challenge. So I think the evolving and developing understanding of how some economic issues have a human rights dimension to it are posing new and quite difficult questions for Irish economic and foreign policy. And I think that the intense discussion around those issues is only going to increase in the years to come.
Okay, just to change tack, but again about something that's changed, because you know, I think there's a saying that it was very easy not to be racist in Ireland, say 40 or 50 years ago, because everyone was white, or the very vast majority. There's been, you know, immigration both intra-EU and from abroad, from outside the EU. There's been issues around asylum seekers and direct provision. It's been interesting the way the Ukrainians have been treated differently to others. I don't know. I know you are not the Immigrant Council of Ireland, but you, as with many things, there's a law and order aspect to this, which means, and civil liberties, which means ICL gets involved. I don't know if something you'd like to comment on that, because that's something that's also very new in Ireland.
Yeah, and I think you can look at those questions from a human rights perspective, and you can also look at those issues from the perspective of quality of life and attractiveness of Ireland as a country to live in and to do business in as well. I mean, first of all, I think I wouldn't agree that Ireland didn't have problems with racism when we were more monocultural. There was clearly very profound problems of racism in Ireland, with regard to people of other race and colour, but obviously towards other groups within society, in particular travellers. But yeah, I mean, Ireland has changed obviously unrecognisably in the last 25 or 30 years or so. And what we are seeing is that some of our policies and structures have been slow to adapt. And from a human rights perspective, the international bodies, such as the Council of Europe and the UN and so on, are increasingly putting pressure on Ireland on those issues. For example, pushing Ireland to introduce laws on hate crime, pushing pressure on Ireland to reform our asylum policy, as you say, Malachy, with regard to things like abolishing direct provision. And that international pressure is having a real impact on Irish government policy, because you are certainly seeing positive moves in recent years, where pressure from above, from the international community, and from below, from community activists at the national level here, are both combining to change policy. But I think what's interesting is that we're also seeing these issues now as business issues. And IBEC and others, the Irish Umbrella Employer Group, is talking about the need and the commercial value of mainstreaming business and human rights policies and strategies within the Irish corporate model. And we're talking about Ireland's attractiveness towards inward investment, but also Ireland's attractiveness towards talent coming into the country, and quality of life issues about tolerance, you know, the experience of minorities living here are hugely relevant, particularly to the highly mobile workforce we have working in sectors like pharma and technology. So I think that there is a growing understanding from both a business and human rights perspective of the synergies that are there when we look to questions of reputation for Irish companies as employers and as people to do business with, and as we talk about Ireland's attractiveness as a place to work and to live. So I think we are seeing an interesting conversation. And it also then links in towards things like cost of housing and cost of living in Ireland as well, which are human rights issues in terms of homelessness and poverty, but are also business problems in terms of affordability and attractiveness to operate. So I think that's a really interesting change we're starting to see.
And just to change tack and bring in this kind of Spanish-Irish link, because I was very surprised when I got here, and it isn't talked about that much in Spain, but it is there and people are aware of it, was that there was a whole, what would I say, furore or debate about Catholic-run hospitals and doctors kind of illegally selling children for adoption to wealthy families and telling the mother that the child had died. And, you know, this, and when I saw that, I saw parallels with Ireland, where we had mother and baby homes and Magdalene laundries. And I know Ireland's done a lot to deal with this. And I mean, I saw when the women from the mother and baby homes went to the Mansion House a few years ago, but there's been a whole series of attempts at restitution on this in Ireland, which I know ICCL have been involved in. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, because that's something, there's a similar sort of issue across both countries.
Absolutely. And I think there's very difficult historical experience in Ireland, which is, I suppose, primarily grounded in the way in which the independent Irish state subcontracted essential social services to religious bodies. And I think we're all familiar with the outline of what that was. The experience in Spain has a slightly different historical dimension to it, obviously to do with the period of dictatorship and the role of the state from that perspective. But what's happened, I think, is that activists in Ireland and in Spain, and indeed in some South American countries as well, which have also been dealing with similar questions about issues around the adoption of children, the identity of children, and the denial of identity to certain children, is that in all of those different countries and historical geographical contexts, there has been a move to adopt a human rights analysis of what happened. And there has been the use of language around disappearances, and there are UN conventions on the right of disappeared persons. That whole concept of thinking about the problem in that way, about disappearances being a very specific human rights violation with its own consequences and obligations. That idea was first developed in the Argentinian and South American context, but has been more recently applied to the Spanish experience and has also been used in the Irish experience. So my former colleague, Dr. Maeve O'Rourke, and groups that have been working for justice for Irish women and children that were in institutions here, including Magdalene laundries and orphanages, have adopted the same legal analysis as has been used in Argentina and Spain, and has brought that to the United Nations with a high degree of success. So although the experiences come from a different origin, we are seeing common analysis about, crucially, the obligation on the state to effectively investigate what happened in the past, and in some instances to apportion blame. Now, in Spain, we have seen criminal prosecutions for persons involved in that phenomenon. In Ireland, we haven't. And perhaps that is not going to be something that's going to happen here. But this question of the obligation on the state to investigate and have accountability in terms of the truth is still a very pressing question here today. And I think, again, if we are talking about Ireland, you know, fulfilling its potential as a leader on human rights, this is one of the things that's really holding us back at the moment. You know, this really painful, difficult legacy from the past.
Okay, thanks, Liam. I just want to go, there's a couple of questions because there's a few, and they're sort of coming at from different angles. One is a kind of, it's a change of tone, it's a more practical one. Ellen has asked, what advice would you give to graduates seeking a career in human rights, a BA in European Studies and then an MSc in human rights? Or I guess there's many routes.
Yeah, I mean, there are opportunities through the international bodies, you know, through the Council of Europe and the United Nations. The human rights, the range of employment in Ireland in human rights probably isn't huge. It's not as big as it would be in the big centres of human rights, which are in London, in Geneva, and Brussels, I suppose, in a European context. But there are certainly some very strong organizations based here. And one advice I would suggest for people interested in exploring an idea, a career in this area, is not just to focus on the organizations that call themselves human rights organizations solely, like Amnesty International, for example. But there's a huge range of other organizations that do work which includes human rights. And in particular, the development organizations would have a very strong grounding in human rights. So that might be something that's worth exploring. We have very strong academic institutions in Ireland that specialize in human rights, particularly the Irish Centre for Human Rights in National University of Ireland, Galway, but also bodies in UCD and Queen's in Belfast and UCC in Cork. And finally, also, we now have a very large and strong Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. That's a state body which is independent of the government, but which is doing incredibly valuable work in strengthening human rights in Ireland. And that's a new range of opportunities that wasn't there before.
But I guess in terms of academic qualifications to get into those roles, well, I think that might have been part of what she was asking.
Yeah, I mean,
you don't need a law degree, for example. There are other routes.
There are other routes, absolutely. And we see people coming into work in our organization. Many will come from a legal background, but there's a lot of people coming from other areas as well now. At the moment, we have computer scientists working in the Irish Council for Civil Liberties to help us work on issues like digital rights, you know, that understand how artificial intelligence works, because that's a really hot area for human rights at the moment. We have journalists who are interested in how the press can be used to advance human rights. And there are people coming from a culture and arts background, digital content creators, filmmakers. So there are, you know, a wide range of skills now working in human rights organizations.
Okay, I hope that answers the question for Ellen. And there was another question just about, because I know ICCL is a 26 county organization, but how do you think, and I remember when I was on the board, obviously there's overlap because things happen across both jurisdictions, but what's the relationship with Northern Ireland and how things are done between ICCL and whatever the bodies are there?
I mean, it's complicated, as everything to do with Northern Ireland is, and it's likely to become more complicated in the years to come. Human rights has always been a really important theme in trying to achieve peace in Northern Ireland. And human rights protections were central to the Good Friday Agreement. You know, that it was part of the glue that held the whole thing together, is that there were guarantees to protect the rights of all communities in the North. So we have a very strong community of human rights organizations working in the North, some of whom would have worked on conflict-related issues in the past and are now working happily in peacetime now. What I would say is that the situation is changing quickly post-Brexit, that we're now seeing a whole range of new human rights problems presenting in the North, in the border, and in the South, around things like migrants' rights, you know, non-Irish, non-UK based people living in the North, who a couple of years back had very strong protections under EU law and now are in a legal limbo, you know. We have a British government, I think it's fair to say, that is trying to undermine a lot of the human rights bodies and laws because they're talking about taking the UK out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is a real problem for people living in the North. And I think that there are legitimate fears about the destabilization of the peace process and the impact that might have. So I think, sadly, we're in a deteriorating situation about the protection of human rights in the North. And also, we're all trying to think through what might be the human rights implications of a constitutional debate about the future of the island a border poll or whatever else that might look like. So I'd say the situation was quite stable for quite a while post Good Friday, and now we're going into a period which is much more uncertain.
Yes, it's uncertain at every level, I think, just looking at what's happening even on a daily basis. We have another question here from Nuria, who's our president, but she's normally here in Madrid, but she seems to be in Rathmines tonight. Now she's asking, it's in the context of Russia and Ukraine and how Germany got dependent on Russian oil and gas, and they're still trading. And this idea of balancing commercial economic needs as a country and the defense of human rights as a European country. And I know you've touched on this a bit about the industrial sectors Ireland's involved in.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's international treaties on this, or is it just international consensus, or how is this managed? And, you know, there were sanctions imposed very quickly on Russia this time, but that was many years after they could have been done. I don't know. It's human rights and it's economics and geopolitics.
Well, we've been talking a little bit about how Ireland has kind of grounded its image and its reputation around human rights, you know, which I think has been a very wise and very fruitful course for Ireland to take over many decades. And it's put us in the category of countries like New Zealand and Norway and Finland and so on. You know, we're generally regarded as being in that very top tier of countries that pride themselves on human rights. The European Union, similarly, you know, talks about the whole union being grounded on European values of democracy and human rights. And it has a Charter of Fundamental Rights. It requires every country that joins the EU to sign up to a lot of human rights principles. So that's distinct from, you know, other parts of the world. It's right in the DNA of what we say we're about. But just as Ireland's reputation only really stands up as long as we actually practice what we preach, I think there are really serious existential questions for the EU in the same regard, you know, and that is why the EU is facing a number of real challenges to its credibility with regard to human rights. One is how its trade interests balance its interests with Ukraine. That's one issue, absolutely. Another, though, is how hard a line is it willing to hold with its own member states when they blatantly violate human rights and democratic norms? And this is a particular challenge with regard to Hungary at the moment, this Hungarian government, and to a lesser extent, the governments in countries like Poland and Bulgaria, you know, where there are real problems about free press, free elections, and so on. And the third is the record of the EU on migrants trying to enter its territory. And I think you touched on this earlier, Mal, you know, the positive response of EU states to welcoming refugees from Ukraine is a good story in terms of human rights, but it is only casting in either sharper relief the record of the EU in terms of how it receives migrants from other parts of the world. And this plays out obviously very particularly in Spain and Italy and Greece, but it's an issue for the EU as a whole. So I would say, yes, what's happening with Ukraine is a credibility challenge to Europe's image of itself and human rights, but it's one of a number that are happening at the same time. And that creates a real identity crisis, I think, for the EU in terms of its respect for human rights.
Okay, thanks, Liam. I'm looking at the clock and we're nearly 45 minutes in, and I think we said we'd do 40. I don't know if there's any more questions. I mean, I think I'd either ask the questions that have come in or they've sort of come up in the conversation. So I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to cover, Liam?
Well, I see that there was one question there about the role of bodies like ombudsmen and so on as well in respecting human rights. And I think that is hugely important because We talked, I suppose, today about what governments can do to promote human rights, what the international bodies can force governments to do, what groups on the ground and individuals on the ground can pressure and campaign for. But also modern democracies like ours also find sophisticated ways to build in checks and balances. And in many countries, that will be human rights commissions, but it'll also be ombudsmen. It'll be bodies like inspectors of prisons, police oversight bodies, and so on. And you see these also at the EU level, where you have the European Ombudsman, who again is an Irish woman, Emily O'Reilly. And they perform crucial functions. And a lot of what we do in ICCL and our colleagues in Spain and elsewhere do is we campaign for strong oversight bodies. So the number one thing we're doing, for example, in the area of digital rights is calling for Ireland to have a strong data protection commission. But we're also calling for strong oversight bodies for the police and for our prisons as well. So I suppose Europe is a global leader in terms of having strong democratic structures at the national level. But it's always an ongoing challenge to make these fit for purpose to meet new challenges.
Yes, thanks, Liam. And it's a constant struggle, because just as you fix one problem, another one pops up somewhere else. It's a bit like whack-a-mole. I think I've covered everything. I don't know if Mary, if you want to say anything, or...
Well, just a big thank you, I guess. It was very interesting, eye-opening, and yes, a big challenge, I think, for any civil rights group in an independent country, as you were saying, about cross boundaries and involving other governments. So it's been a delight to listen to you and to hear your challenges. It's unfortunate that we didn't have the other part of the boxing ring with us tonight, if you like, but it was delightful to have you on, and thank you very much, Liam. Let you
Thanks,
sign
Mike.
off now.
Okay, yep, thanks everyone.
Okay.